What I'll be discussing today is episode 562, parts 1 and 2 of the podcast This American Life. The episode is called The Problem We All Live With. Now, this particular episode of the podcast is super interesting and focuses on education and integration. Yes, integration as in desegregation. We get to hear from Nicole Hannah-Jones as she explains how a district in Missouri accidentally created a program that made desegregation a reality for about 1,000 students. You may be saying, well, isn't desegregation like a thing already? Well, no. The reality is, our schools today are still absolutely segregated. Here's a quote from Nicole Hannah-Jones. In the St. Louis area, nearly 1 in 2 Black children attend schools in districts that perform so poorly the state has stripped them of full accreditation. Only 1 in 25 white children are in a district like that. That's 1 in 2 Black kids, 1 in 25 white kids. Part 1 of the episode digs into the facts and the timeline of the downfall of Normandy School District, which is the district that Michael Brown graduated from a mere 3 weeks before he was murdered, as well as the stories of a student called Maria and her mother Nadra and another student named Brianna as they transfer to their new school, Francis Howell, which, by the way, is about 85% white. Now, Francis Howell is located about 30 miles away from Normandy School District. Normandy shows Francis Howell as the school district for their students that they would go to if they choose to transfer, simply because Normandy wanted to make it inconvenient for students to leave. That's messed up. Now, Normandy School District has not just recently slipped up. They've been on probation with the state for 15 years. That means that entire classes of kids have started in kindergarten and risen through high school and beyond, receiving a subpar education. I should say, Black kids are receiving a subpar education, and is completely unjust and unconstitutional. The episode really gets into how some of the harsh realities that the systems that were supposed to be providing education to these students were actually doing their best to keep their students trapped in an environment where they were receiving an unfair, unjust education, and what white people were doing as well, specifically parents using scare tactics to keep these Black students out of their schools. Actual quotes generated from a sea of about 3,000 white parents who were fighting to keep Black students out of Francis Howell can be seen on the slide now. The reason that these parents were so angry were pathetic and frankly quite racist. I would like to remind you that the transfer law that allowed Normandy students to leave and attend Francis Howell was created in 2013. 2013. A mere 5 years ago, white parents were saying these things about Black students in Missouri. Nicole Hannah-Jones reminds us that your zip code is the anchor that traps you, and all Normandy students want is to escape. They want a better education, the one they deserve, the one they are legally obligated to have. Now, after fighting to get their education at Francis Howell, the students get a glimmer of hope. Things are going well for them for the most part, as students and teachers want them to be there and support them. But only 1 year later, their hope is torn down before. Part 2 of the series dives into how the Normandy School District, greedy for students to stay in their district, create an entirely new, non-accredited school district called the Normandy Schools Collaborative, which gives them a different accreditation from their previously determined unaccredited school district. This means that the transfer law that allowed students to leave Normandy is now pulling them back in to essentially the same district as before. Francis Howell quickly jumps on this with encouragement from white parents who, despite all that they said would happen, did not experience any violence or threats of violence from the union of the school districts. Francis Howell decides that students must return to Normandy or find another school because they are not welcome back there. Nedra Martin describes this move sadly as a herd of cattle being herded back to where they came from. Normandy parents decide to file a lawsuit against the state. The state hears them, and a judge makes the statement that every day a student attends a school without accreditation, the child could suffer a harm that cannot be repaired. With that ruling, Normandy students were again allowed to leave, but Francis Howell was not accepting them, not without an individual injunction from the judge. Maria got permission to return to Francis Howell for 9th grade. Even after all of that, in 2015, she does not know if she will be able to stay. Brianna does not return to Francis Howell, and at her graduation, the Vice President of Education for the state of Missouri apologizes to her class, saying that the state is sorry for not providing the education experience that they should have had. Listening to this absolute injustice was really difficult for me, as someone who wants to go into the education field while simultaneously advocating for equity in education. Hearing that such blatant, selfish inequality still exists is not exactly heartwarming. I know this sort of thing happened in the past, and definitely had suspicions that it still carries true, but to hear in such detail exactly how these students were affected was extremely disheartening and infuriating. To hear how those white parents spoke about these black children as though they were less than or like they were beings that needed to be controlled, like all they would add to their environment was violence and drugs, was horrible. And I hope that these parents realize that what they said was recorded and exists online for everyone they know to hear. To the mother who claims it is not a race issue, it is absolutely a race issue. When you are denying these students based on unfounded presumptions, it becomes a race issue. To the father who suggested starting school earlier to make schools seem less attractive to students from Normandy, do you really think that 20 minutes is going to make a student who deserves a rightful education and knows it to be deterred by your suggestion? Think again. To the school board who claims that they don't want the black students either, you're in the wrong business if you only want to work with the white kids. That's not reality, and you're harming both the white children and the children of color when you make statements like that. And lastly, to the mother who demands metal detectors in the schools, do you not realize that it is dominantly white males who are causing mass shootings across the country? It is ridiculous to assume these students want to cause violence rather than to receive a better education and future. In addition to being furious at these comments that were made, I am deeply disturbed by the comments of the superintendent, Charles Pearson. When told that there are children who are not getting a proper education while the school district figures itself out, he merely responds with, "It is the reality of where they are," as though the nature of their education can be fixed later. He later confirms that he does not know if it's possible for a black child in Missouri to get an equal education. Hearing that is incredibly disheartening. These are innocent children who want an equal education, just like any other child. Again, they are being forced into boxes based on predetermined factors, the product of their zip code. I cannot think of anything more unfair than being judged and labeled based on something you cannot change. This type of hatred towards a community is infectious. It will trickle down into the minds of your children and spread into the minds of your community members. It will cause a burning hatred for others inside of them, one fueled by injustice and anger. This is not the type of future that we as a country need. Rather, we need a country that will be filled with love and acceptance. A country that will celebrate diversity and look forward to diving into differences. A country fueled by peace and understanding, empathy and kindness. If a student comes into a situation where there is someone unlike them, they should not be inclined to avoid that person. Rather, they should be wanting to learn who they are and explore their relation to each other. We must teach our students an attitude of curiosity and exploration. When students are curious and eager, behavioral issues disappear. When the subject matter is relevant to them, they are engaged. And when the unknown stranger becomes a friend, a relationship is formed for life. But digging into the statistics, as previously mentioned, this type of discrimination exists. 1/2 of black students are attending an institution that isn't accredited. That's completely not okay. These students become less likely to graduate and go on to higher education or receive technical certification, which is basically a requirement to get a job that isn't minimum wage. And without digging too much into the politics of raising the minimum wage, it can be said that those who live off of it tend to live paycheck to paycheck, and sometimes even that isn't enough. It's definitely important to get the topic out there to other educators about what is going on in other schools and districts. It's significant to note that this episode was created in 2015. That means it's pretty recent and that this kind of stuff is still going on in our country. Talking about diversity in our schools is a way to increase awareness of other cultures and raise appreciation for others who live differently than we do. It's a great way to unseat whiteness as the dominant culture and can only be achieved through a commitment from everyone involved. This includes administration. Cultural talks led by students or guest speakers or even the principal is a great way to include everyone in the community in this commitment. Another way that teachers could promote diversity is by picking out literature that reflects people who are not white men. Looking into our figures in history who are women, queer, people of color, not able-bodied, so on and so forth, is so important for students because then they see representation no matter who they are. That being said, diversity is truly something that cannot be taught. It must be experienced. It is not measurable. Intersectionality theory states that we are all both advanced advantaged and disadvantaged, and that, in that, nobody is more advantaged or disadvantaged than another. Therefore, it is not something we can evaluate a person for like we can with test scores. Instead, we can teach kindness, gratitude, and respect. Although these are not measurable traits either, we can see them in our actions, and thus students can learn them as well. Teaching students how to be morally sound human beings is important in raising them to be functioning members of society. In addition to moral values, we can teach inequalities and privilege. We can teach students to read up and reach out, to ask questions when something seems unfair, to stand up for others who need help, to speak for those who are silenced. Education consists of much more than reading from a textbook. There are life lessons that must be learned along the way, and I can only hope that when I become an educator, my students will learn these life lessons with me.